We've been playing around with the development of geothermal beginning in the late 1970s, probably by the early 1980s. The state does some early drilling, finds the combination of heat and water right along the rift of Kilauea, which is the most active volcano on the earth. And the first efforts in geothermal are somewhat pioneering. Small geothermal generating plant, water's not re-injected, it's put out in big ponds, it's kind of big and ugly, and the steam is going off all of the time. But it basically proved the concept that geothermal was there and it could be developed. But living next to that at that point in time was a little messy. There weren't a lot of residents nearby, but there was a lot of subdivision around that area that had been there for some years. So people were moving into that community. And in the early years, you know, the pictures look like any kind of early industrial effort. Subsequent development of the power, they went through a geothermal permitting process, actually permitted to do 60 megawatts of power. We're now at 32, I think, 36 maybe, Robbie, I forget exactly. But they've been developed now as a fairly clean and dependable source of baseload power. All fluids are re-injected. There are periodic small leakages. The key issue from the community perspective are a couple of things. One is release of hydrogen sulfide, which is part of the geothermal reservoir, odor associated with that, and a bit of noise and a bit of kind of anxiety about the power plant. In 1991, there was in fact a major blowout during a drilling event that allowed for a 31-hour uncontrolled venting of the well before they got it under control. So there's a history that kind of makes the neighborhood uncomfortable about geothermal. But nevertheless, it's now a fairly key piece of the Big Island's baseload power. It's about 20% of the baseload power and meets a substantial portion of what the utilities are trying to accomplish in terms of green energy and upping our alternative energy source. But there remains in the community a fairly strong group of people who are being reminded and remember or moved into and were educated about the long history, some of which not so pretty, blowout fears and the like. So there's a fairly strong and well-organized opposition to this, to geothermal continuing to happen. This is fed by, in the real early years, by this concern that somehow manganese nodules were going to be pumped off the earth and they're going to look for a place with cheap energy that they could turn into an industrial complex for the purpose of processing nodules. This is a 1970s concern. And then back in the 2010s, this notion that somehow a cable would be run between the Big Island and Oahu and we would be providing a substantial portion of the island's energy from geothermal resources, to wit, that community would be the primary neighbor and or they would live with the impacts of that industrial use while the power got shipped off to Honolulu. So every time state government would start talking about a new cable and a new 100 megawatts and the utility company put out an RFP for another 50 megawatts, the community is concerned about the ramping up of this particular science in their backyard. Not science, it's technology. So they become very good at arguing points that are hard to argue alternatives on. And about 2 years ago, partly as a result of an emerging political mayor's race, and looking to build to creating issue, I think, as part of this. There were a series of public bills in the county council that looked to address the public health related issues of geothermal. And in typical fashion, these are 3 minutes to testify. You got your opportunity to stand up and say whatever you want to say about your health. And the community showed up in fairly large numbers, making all kinds of allegations about exploding uteruses and people being sick and how we're all sick and everybody's sick. And there was no way to kind of foil those or test any of those claims, but it makes for good press and it makes for media sitting at all of these meetings, and health became a big issue. A current mayor saw the politics underlying this process and also thought that the solution being proposed wasn't the appropriate solution. He vetoed the bill and they withheld his override. But the issue still persists. There's still this sense or concern that there is a health problem related to the geothermal power. So I got to work in the legislature, in the mayor's office, in kind of a special projects consultant role for a time on agriculture and a couple of other issues. And while I was there, this issue was emerging. And because I'd been in ongoing conversation with Peter on this whole lack of civil discourse and our inability to deal with complex issues in a responsible way, we started talking about the geothermal solution, and we talked joint fact-finding. So I started to plant seeds within the context of the mayor's office, managing director and others, and maybe there's a way to address this in a logical way that we can get to the bottom of it. One of the things the community had done is they had already selected a researcher, the community, the activist community, had selected a researcher who they thought could come and do a public health study, and we'll show you this problem. Well, if you go on his website, he's one of these guys who's never seen an H2S molecule that he liked. And at whatever level, it's kind of unsafe at any speed, kind of a approach. So clearly, if a scientist like that took on this project under their direction, you'd end up with a very blame-oriented response that the report would give you to undercut the credibility of geothermal and the growth of this potentially useful energy resource. So I guess we were successful at getting the conversation up into the mayor's office, and the mayor said, you know, look, fortunately Peter works for peanuts, but was willing to take on this topic. And he and the mayor, I think, in a couple of conversations got on well, and he's a very bright guy, and he's local Puna boy under 40, and surfer, and he is going to do nothing that's going to hurt the region that he lives in. At the same time, he's a strong supporter of geothermal and sees this as an important part of the island's future. So had both sides of the concern in his heart. So basically, to enable this to happen, we had to say to the mayor, look, this is an issue you need not to be involved with at all. That you need to turn this issue over to Peter and say, let him go and have these conversations. I don't want you to appoint people to sit on these councils or whatever. And he was most happy for that. I mean, it really gave him a much easier way to step back. He could ultimately at the end could say, well, that was stupid Adler, he failed, and didn't have any of his own particular skin in the game. But he's also really willing to try something new. He is an attorney, he has a very sharp mind, and he really realized that the end game, if it looked like dueling science, ultimately was not going to accomplish anything. You're scientists and our scientists. So let's go figure out what that science is supposed to look like. So basically that's the way it came down. It was a fairly simple contract. I don't know, it was a 50 grand or something. It wasn't a lot of money, but it said, you know, go forth, Peter, and walkabout. And this is what Peter does in these circumstances. Goes on and does a walkabout, and we gave him some names of people he should talk to, and maybe these people could help you understand. So he put together a group of a dozen folks that included both of the most strident activists in this group, some fairly, and others aligned with him, epidemiologists from the pharmacy school, the gas expert from the Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and a group of community members. Some of them were quite new to the community, but brought good monitoring skill or background or had some kind of technological resource to provide. He held, I don't know, it was somewhere around 9 months. I think he added up about 1,500 hours of people's time over that period of time. Meetings mostly on Sundays, Sunday afternoons that went for 5 to 6 or 7 hours, and really focused and held the conversation around core questions. And the whole process started with what are the key questions we're trying to solve for here, and trying to bring all conversation back to those core questions. And that's really was the art of, you know, Adler's experience in this conversation was to try and shape these conversations and to keep them on track. All meetings were open to the public. They were all in a public community hall. People could come in and sit around the table and watch this conversation. They couldn't say anything until the end, and then they were welcome to make comments. But that we didn't have to wait for these comments at the early stages where it was going to take your first 2 hours of energy, throw it out the window like the councils do. But people came fresh, worked hard, stayed on the topic. You know, I hear some Peter's thoughts on this thing, but it was a very constructive conversation, and the geothermal developer was there, the state was there, and just kind of hoping something good would come from this process. In the end, the report, which came out in September last year, had about 9 recommendations in it. This was not in trying to resolve the science, but it was trying to focus the questions about what issue, how do you address the question of community health? And so several of these, there were questions about groundwater monitoring and the impacts of re-injecting back into the groundwater with some of the small amount of chemicals that go back in with the re-injection. Concerns for monitoring. There was a real lack of confidence in the monitoring technologies around the outside of the plant. And you know, if it's the industry's data, then they don't trust that industry's data. Or if it was on an hourly basis rather than every 5-minute basis, you don't know what the variations of this chemical exposures were. Now, their biggest concern was really that they wanted a health study, and they wanted a health study to be done in the community to try and identify if what there were central nervous system issues, respiratory issues, or kind of anxiety kinds of related issues that could be traced back to the geothermal plant. Tough scientific questions, particularly in an arena in which there's a fairly small population base around the outside, so you have a fairly small sample size to work from, and to a very low, relatively over the last 20 years, except for a couple of events, very low exposure indication. So it makes for tough science, but it's in an area of unclear science, and there is in the scientific community some different points of view about the impacts of high toxicity H2S clear science. Everybody knows what it is, over 100 or parts per million, you're going to die. At the lower level, it's not as clear. Anyway, long story short, that report delivered to the mayor, summarized into short little blips so he could read it. Peter's a pretty good writer, so we didn't have to do a lot of we could pull pieces out of it. Every one of their recommendations is doable. Let's make it happen now. There is a geothermal asset fund that provided some funding for this stuff, so it wasn't like he had to not pave a road and do this. There's already a resource that was independent to help to do this. So we have been for the last 3 to 4 months trying to knock these individual pieces off the table. So there are 3 studies, groundwater. We're doing a meta-analysis of all of the work that's been done on H2S so that we can have a broad picture of what the rest of the field has done over the years. But the community still really wants a health study, and we're still struggling with what the scope of that looks like and how to go through a process, because the last thing we want to do is to get to this spot and have the study itself be subject to another critique because we picked the wrong guys, or we went through a process, or we didn't do what they wanted. So that Peter recommended that we let this advisory group kind of go off into the sunset and go about and do what we want to do. The mayor chose to say, look, we're going to keep these guys inside, we're going to hold on to them, we'll consult with them on an ongoing basis, keep them in close contact. I think that's a good decision on the mayor's part, because what it's done is allow us to have an ongoing conversation so that as we work into the study, we can actually include them in a little bit of the selection process, and ultimately the outcome won't be something that is a surprise, decide, announce, and defend kind of a solution, but something that they